It's very easy now to focus on the beginning of the decline of the Star Trek franchise with the J.J. Abrams bad robot era, which began in 2009, and it's absolutely true that Star Trek has never been the same since then. It's become darker, more adult, more action-oriented, less intelligent, less optimistic, and of course, since Star Trek Discovery in 2017, it's become more, well, woke. Since then, Star Trek's decline has only accelerated, as it's clearly being written by people who don't fully understand the franchise. Star Trek has always been niche, and every attempt to try to change that, to make it appeal to a wider audience, has always failed, and only served to alienate existing fans, because it means turning it into something completely different. That's what the J.J. Abrams Kelvin timeline films did. They brought in a younger cast and turned Star Trek into a generic Hollywood blockbuster franchise with dumb jokes, breathless and relentless action sequences, and paper-thin plots. The three Kelvin timeline movies failed to ask any interesting or thought-provoking philosophical questions about humanity, which Star Trek typically aspired to do. They instead sought to offer something that was like a poor imitation of Star Trek, without any of its intelligence, depth, and soul. These were brainless popcorn movies to be consumed and discarded after watching. Since 2009, the Star Trek productions in the theatres and the various TV shows, live action and animated, none of them have been the kind of Star Trek we used to get from 1966 to 2005. And by that I mean, Star Trek used to inspire young people to pursue careers in fields like technology, science, and aerospace. But not these days. Now Star Trek is a shell of its former self, instead feeling closer to a self-aware parody at times. Now, there was still fantastic Star Trek being made up until 2005 with the ending of Star Trek Enterprise. That show had finally hit its stride in its fourth and final season, making its cancellation all the more egregious. But there was a chunk of the Trek fanbase that had kind of checked out at that point, as Star Trek had been in decline for several years. I remember older Trek fans complaining about how Voyager felt like it was kind of divorced from the original series. Enterprise's first two seasons were reasonable but not great, and the 9th and 10th Star Trek films, 1998's Star Trek Insurrection and 2002's Star Trek Nemesis, were critical and commercial failures at the box office, especially Nemesis. Voyager was a decent enough show, and on occasion a great show. I really enjoyed Voyager for the most part, but even at the time when it first aired, there was a feeling that the writers and producers were playing it too safe, failing to allow the show to leave its comfort zone, and instead settling creatively for a kind of third-gear TNG light feel. Voyager ended in 2001 and was followed by Enterprise, which concluded, like I say, in 2005. But prior to that, you had Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which overlapped with Voyager for 5 years. DS9 ended in 1999 in a 7th and final season that kind of divides the fan base a little bit, with some people maintaining it was the weakest of the 7 seasons. But that is to be expected of a show that's run for 7 years. I mean, similar criticisms have been levelled at TNG's final season as well. But I think the absolute high point of the Trek franchise, its high watermark moment, was between 1994 and 1996. There was an amazing energy and buzz around Star Trek at that time. It was absolutely stratospheric, because TNG had just ended with an absolutely phenomenal series finale in All Good Things, and the TNG cast were gearing up for their big screen debut with Star Trek Generations, which would feature an eagerly awaited crossover with the original series and the landmark meeting of Captains James T. Kirk and Jean-Luc Picard. That was certainly a big deal. All the while that was happening, Deep Space Nine was about to enter its 3rd season, and a new series was about to begin after Generations. In 1995, Voyager would debut with a really solid pilot in the form of The Caretaker. So there was a lot happening, and during this period, It felt that Star Trek could do no wrong. Even Time magazine featured Captain Kirk and Picard on the front cover. Generations, a film I quite like, would still prove to be a bit of a disappointment, but successful enough to warrant another TNG film. That leads us to 1996, the high point of the Star Trek franchise. After Star Trek First Contact, there was the beginning of a slow decline. Admittedly, a very slow decline. First Contact was very well received and commercially successful, and Voyager and DS9 were in their third and fifth seasons respectively. Two very solid seasons of Star Trek. Now don't get me wrong, there was plenty of fantastic Star Trek episodes on television between 1996 and 2005, but the quality of stories did become less consistent in those final 9 years, and the film franchise never recovered after Star Trek First Contact. Of that, there can be little disagreement. Voyager's fourth season was arguably its best, as was DS9's sixth season, but Insurrection in 1998 was a poor movie, which underperformed at the box office. When DS9 ended in 1999 with a solid series finale, What You Leave Behind, there was a sense that the formula, as it was then, had begun to grow tired. Now, it's hard for me to say this today in 2023 because when some people hear me say this, they think I'm bashing the franchise back then, but I'm not. It's easy for their perspective of late 1990s and early 2000s Star Trek to be coloured by nostalgia and by the fact that New Trek is so poor by comparison. So when I'm talking about the decline of Star Trek between 96 and 2005, everything is relative, right? It's easy to look back with rose-tinted glasses, but in truth, I remember the complaints at the time all over the forums. The fans were growing tired of Voyager, and many people, myself included at the time, did not like the rumours that Star Trek was about to do a prequel series based in the 22nd century. Fans were not exactly clamouring for that idea. Enterprise's first 2 seasons were actually decent by today's standards, but ratings declined sharply after the atrocious episode A Night in Sickbay in the second season, and the showrunners were forced to radically retool the series for the third season. The Xindi story arc was developed. That was actually the point where I really started to love Enterprise, but I recognise I'm among the minority of fans in that respect. Star Trek Nemesis was released in 2002, the final TNG feature film, and it remains to this day the only Star Trek film to have failed to break even at the box office. Enterprise was cancelled at the end of its third season, but brought back for one final season, likely to help it achieve enough episodes to warrant syndication. My intention with this video is twofold. Firstly, I'm explaining, and I hope I'm being clear here, that the Star Trek franchise was in decline several years before it was placed on hiatus in 2005. Despite there being many great moments and solid stories between 1996 and 2005, signs of creative and commercial decline were obvious in those final 9 years. Now, I recognize that there's lots of people who came to the Star Trek franchise for the first time during that era and absolutely loved what they saw, and I totally acknowledge that. It was still a great period, but it was the decline of the golden era of Star Trek. Secondly, I want to highlight something that frustrates myself and many fans. Modern New Trek is not a patch on the caliber of Star Trek that we got between 1996 and 2005, which is saying a lot. And yet, New Trek shows continue and new ones are greenlit despite being of much lower quality. And that's the thing. I would rather rewatch any Star Trek episode from the late 1990s to the early 2000s than watch what we're getting today. Star Trek Picard's third season being an exception, but ultimately that's only one season. Its first 2 seasons are utterly unwatchable. Discovery is completely unwatchable. Strange New Worlds is closer to being a big budget spoof of the original series. Lower Decks is basically Rick and Morty with the Star Trek veneer. Prodigy is really for kids with a cast of characters that look like something from either Guardians of the Galaxy or Monsters, Inc. And would you really have high hopes for this new Star Trek Starfleet Academy series or a Section 31 movie? My point is, even when classic Berman era Trek was in its final days, it was still capable of pumping out far superior Star Trek to what new Trek pumps out on its best days. Even the weakest episodes of Enterprise, Voyager, and DS9 are light years ahead of what we get now, because at least they felt like actual Star Trek. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching this video. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.